Now to a quick look at our photo of the day. Young boy in Portland, Oregon, holding a sign that said "Free Hugs" at a Ferguson protest. Police officer asked the boy for a hug, and you can see the embrace and the tears that overcame that young child's face. Now, as protests over the Ferguson decision blanket the country today, as I said, the president held a series of meetings with members of his administration, civil rights leaders, and law enforcement officials to try and find ways to ease the tension between police and minorities, not just in Missouri, but this is in communities across the country. And the president, he's proposing a 3-year, $263 million spending package to boost law enforcement training and police department reform. $75 million of that would pay for 50,000 police body cams. The president also announced the formation of a new task force.
Chuck Ramsey, the commissioner of the Philadelphia Police Department, as well as Lori Robinson, who is a professor of criminology, law and society at George Mason University and a former assistant attorney general. They are going to co-chair a task force that is not only going to reach out and listen to law enforcement, community activists, other stakeholders, but is going to report to me specifically in 90 days with concrete recommendations.
Now, the president says, I promise this isn't going to be a typical blue ribbon committee that doesn't go anywhere. We shall see. Okay, but the fury over Ferguson, this does not happen in a vacuum. People in New York now awaiting a decision in the case of Eric Garner. We all remember that case, Dominic, the case in Staten Island where we all learned about chokeholds, right?
Well, Richard, first of all, as we all know tonight, there are protests at this very hour all across the country. And perhaps complicating matters after Ferguson, a grand jury this time in our backyard, Staten Island, could possibly conclude no indictment. This as the families of the 3 recent high-profile police incidents gathered together. It's something they share in common that they would rather not. For the families of Michael Brown, Eric Garner, and the recent accidental shooting at the Brooklyn Housing Project, the first holiday season without their loved ones. Attorney Michael Crump became emotional. I could tell you were really touched. Why?
Because yet again, your heart is broken and you say, when does it work for our children? You know, we do Trayvon, Kendrick Johnson, the list just goes on. And when do they say our children get equal justice? What about our children's due process? That's why we got to change the system. We just can't make noise. We got to make a difference this time.
But if there wasn't enough daily fallout over Ferguson, now the grand jury is expected back any day now in the Garner case. And there is the possibility of no indictment as well. Though community activists like the Reverend Herbert Daughtry believe Staten Island District Attorney Dan Donovan must return an indictment. So, Reverend Daughtry, you've been calling up this problem for more than 30 years. What do you think the indictment ruling from Missouri means to the Garner case?
Well, I don't see how the DA can bring back a no bill and now in the light of what is the upheaval across the country. In addition to the fact that from all evidence would point to this guy need to be indicted and he need to be brought. The person or persons need to be indicted, and let's have a public trial.
The new attorney for the Garner family, Jonathan Moore, continues to hammer away at bringing in special prosecutors.
This is not the first time I've been disappointed at the performance of a prosecutor in these kind of cases, and I think it underscores what we've asked for in many of these cases, that there be a truly independent prosecutor. The district attorneys are very close to the police officers in their counties. They rely on them to make their cases. On some level, you could almost argue it's unfair to expect this district attorney, who comes from a long line of police officers whose father was killed in the line of duty, to put aside all those feelings and try to do a really competent job here. And that's why there should be an independent prosecutor who looks into these cases. And when there is, as we saw in Howard Beach, there was a much different result.
Dominic, you've talked about the Howard Beach case before here. I'm worried. If there is no indictment here on the heels of what happened in Ferguson, the national attention and the built-up anger, things can get pretty ugly.
Well, Richard, all I can tell you, again, I bring the experience of 30 years of covering these cases. I have no emotional involvement one way or the other. But pro-police Staten Island, you have many people who live in Staten Island that are related in one way or another to a police officer. And so police officers in Staten Island, maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, they are going to get every bit of the benefit of the doubt. And so, you know, I'm not in the grand jury room, I don't know, but if I had to bet right now, I would say, despite what the video shows, they're going to return no indictment.
But you know, Bishop, the fact that there is video here, the fact that we all saw it in living color and it wasn't the he said, she said, and we see that infamous video and we hear him saying, I can't breathe, and we also know what precipitated it. He didn't start a confrontation, and moreover, this was loose cigarettes. Listen, I think it would have been great for all involved if there was an independent prosecutor appointed to this thing. But in light that it hasn't, I'm a little worried about.
I think there would be. I think that if no indictment come down, there will be massive protests. I don't think that. I think African Americans in the Northeast is a little bit more sophisticated in terms of understanding that tearing up your community don't help anybody. I think that we understand because in 1968. When I was a young child, they tore up Newark, New Jersey. Yep. And 45 years later, they still trying to rebound Newark, New Jersey. We have a case study right before us. But protesting, nonviolent protesting is the key where we collaboratively come together from various different races and say, enough is enough. I'm not against policing. I'm against how policing is being conducted on African Americans. We need to take a second look at how we treat African Americans.
Well, we talked before about specific remedies. Do you have any solutions?
Well, I applaud our President Obama by his efforts of bringing together civil rights leaders and bringing together law officials. Law officials to come together with a particular recommendation. But let me say this: when the government get involved, there's a bloated bureaucracy. I mean, will the government actually make the necessary changes, or will they cave to a certain group of people in America that don't think there is no problem? That there are a whole lot of people in America that think things is wonderful until it affects them. So what I'm saying, have a wonderful meeting, but I think we need to get to the grassroots. We need to go to the grassroots organizations and say to them, let us begin to collaborate and build together and find how we can sensitize people who are insensitive to one particular race, and that is the African American race.
And I want to get to the dialogue part in a second, but Andrew, there seemed to be a tangible thing the president touched on, which the imagery after the first riots happened there. We saw the armored vehicles, we saw the SWAT teams, we saw whatever. He spoke about that today, didn't he?
Well, yeah, and he's signing an executive order that's going to basically demand greater training for police departments who receive this surplus military gear. So hopefully we don't see the kind of militarized response that we saw in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown back in August. The president, as we also mentioned, wants to put money forward for body cameras for police officers. Every time that's been implemented, that goes a long way towards reducing police violence and claims of police abuse. And I think that would go a lot. I mean, we're all on camera so much every day. Why aren't the cops on camera as well? We're talking about other possible remedies. I think some effective prosecution or at least discipline of police officers who are involved in some of these cases would go a long way to helping people in communities feel like they're getting a fair shot. And, you know, I might also state the obvious that perhaps if there were fewer deaths of unarmed minorities at the hands of police, that would probably help matters a lot too.
It's the numbers. Like, sometimes figures lie, lies figure, Jeannie, but you know polls better than anyone I know. The gap between in the perceptions of how race impacts law enforcement. It's not just Republican and Democrat. It's whites look at it one way, blacks look at it the other way. It's really stark, isn't it?
It's really stark. And you know, one of the issues we're dealing with in New York City is the racial makeup of the police force itself. So, I mean, over the weekend or last week, we saw the second highest Hispanic or Latino officer in leadership retire. That's the second one.
Yeah.
You know, Philip Banks, the leading African American, retired recently. We're losing leadership. And you look at those statistics, Richard, it's shocking. 80% of the leadership of the New York City Police Department is white. 40% of the population is white. So you look at that, 5% is black, 25% of the population is black. So, you know, you look at those stark statistics, and that's another issue we saw in Ferguson. So there's so many ways in which these issues can be corrected, but it's going to be a very slow and long process because it also...
Let me ask you two guys this. If a congregant came to you or a young man, because I know you counsel a young man, and they said, I'm thinking about maybe joining law enforcement, with all the history and the baggage that comes with it, would you encourage them to go into that or not?
Of course, yeah. I served for 6 years as civil service of Mount Vernon, and I would encourage them. In fact, we have the problem in Mount Vernon.
Yeah,
that in Mount Vernon, our community is 85% African American, but our police force is about 65 to 70% white.
Isn't it?
So,
It's a shocking number.
And let me say this: I know some politicians who encourage white people to join on the force and discourage black folks from joining, saying that black people can't police themselves. So it is a systemic, I'm telling you, it is a systemic problem. It is the perception. It's classism at its worst, because there's a lot of blacks that's doing wonderful. But there are a lot of blacks who's doing wonderful feel that African Americans can't police them. So therefore they think this: black is beautiful, but white is grand. That is the mentality that we got to change.
And when the bishop talks about a systematic problem, he's so right, Richard, because I would advise that young person to join the police force, but I would say watch out for the traps.
Right.
Because the traps are this. The police departments all across the country, we want more blacks, we want more blacks, but we can't find qualified ones. That's the game they play. And so you can pass the physical exam for a cop, you can pass the written exam, and then they get you, particularly in New York City, to the psychological exam, reject, because that's a process that some would argue is almost subjective. Your values versus the person's values that you're interviewing. And so that's how a lot of minorities, no, 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 gone, next, next, next. And is it surprising, is it really surprising that management of police departments across the country, almost all white? Are we really surprised at that? Are we really surprised?
It is actually the new plantation. That's the whole concept of the new plantation. You know, you had the master sit up in the big house, and then you had the slave Negroes. Some was in the house, and then you had the field Negroes in the house. But the master, that's what policing has become now. It
I'm
has
glad
become
Bishop
that.
said it. I didn't say it. I'm glad
Yeah,
you said
it
it.
has
though.
become that.
I'm glad you said it.
Okay, but you also know, let's be fair, you also know that the police, NYPD, is dying to have more blacks in law enforcement.
I don't know about that for sure.
Dominic,
I don't know about
you
that
know
for sure.
just perception.
I know.
Perception
I know if
problems
you're the police
alone?
commissioner. I know if you're the police commissioner, you talk a good game about having more blacks on your police force. I know you go through all the process. You give the exam every day.
The civil service exam is biased. The civil service exam lends to the culture of the broader
It's
community.
against the self-interest
That's right,
of
the
both
civil-
Bratton, okay, as well as the mayor here, to have it such, whatever
Richard,
you
Bratton's
want to
gotta
ascribe.
answer to the unions. Look at what happened in St. Louis. The 5 black football players come out and raise their hands. The police union want them disciplined. What do the unions got to do
We're
with
going to
those
get into that
NFL
debate
players?
coming up, yeah.
Quickly, how many people of color are excluded from joining the police department because of a criminal history? You look at New York City in particular, where you have stop and frisk that targets or seems to target disproportionately people of color. That fosters criminal records. You have a criminal record, all of a sudden you're not eligible for
But
police
also,
service.
more insidious, I think, than that is if you grow up, and you guys would know, I wouldn't know, as a young black man, do you really have this strong inclination to join a police force psychologically that you feel has turned against you? So what's the big surprise? right?
And they look at the applications, as much as you may say it's part of the psych exam, will defer. The applications are way down right now in terms of
And
it.
for good reason.
Right, well, you can certainly ascribe it to
Richard,
it.
I know we're over on time, but let's be honest.
yeah.
If you're a black young man, why in the world would you join law enforcement?
The
And
only-
why would,
the
and why
only
would I
compelling-
join something that would oppress me and abuse
Right,
me?
Well, the
Why
only-
would I embrace
right.
it?
Everything you say is right, but the only problem is until the numbers of the police force in Ferguson, in New York City, and whatever don't reflect the communities that they serve, we're going to keep having these problems
But what
in
do we
bigger and
do?
bigger numbers.
What do we
I think
do?
part of it is, not the whole part of it, part of it is you got to have a presence felt. I mean, think about it. The bigger presence you're going to have felt, whether it be the law enforcement, whatever department we're talking about, the better you're going to have for representation. The person's going to have a better idea what's going on in the community than if I was coming in there to police it.
Yeah, but I
I
think
think
it's
that's
bigger than
part
that.
of it. That's not the whole thing,
But I think
but
it's
that's
bigger
part
than
of
that.
it.
I think
I think police cams, body cams are a big thing.
Well,
We don't
man.
guess anymore what's going on if you see what's going on.
But even if you change the dynamic and the composition of and say you have more blacks than whites, it is a systemic psychological problem. It is bigger than that. These, I don't care if they are black officers that abuse power. No. We don't even talking about that. Right now we're talking about white officers who abuse power. But there are black officers who have taken the shield and have used the shield in a manner that is disgraceful. It is systemic. It is a systemic problem with policing in the United States of America.
And Dominic will tell you, I have a systemic problem that I'm way over this break here. So I'm going to go to a break here because one thing, I don't have enough of this time, but I ask you at home here to sound off on Facebook and Twitter on our question. Do you think that the Ferguson case has highlighted the racial divide in America? Some people just say it's one case, but is this something much bigger than that? All right, when we come back here, Janae Rice speaking out for the first time about the attack that has shocked the nation. How are women across the country reacting to her Stand By Her Man basic address here? We'll have more on that after this.